So good evening to all of you. Well, it's fantastic to have so many of you online tonight. It's a huge honor and a privilege, Clem, to have you back. And I know that you have always been the most sought after speaker of anyone literally around the world. And so it's a real honor and a privilege to have you back tonight. And so excited to hear about the latest scenarios and kind of where you think the global planet's going and global economy and South Africa, etc. You know, I think we've got a lot in store for the people who are online tonight. So welcome, Clem. It's awesome to have you.
Thank you, and I look forward to trying to give people a steer on the future.
Awesome. So I just wanted to just kind of set a bit of a framework around tonight and really kind of give people a little bit of an understanding. You know, I think the one thing that's important is that tonight we're going to give people scenarios, we're going to give them models and methodologies, but it is always really important that everyone takes control and, you know, looks after their own, you know, destinies, their own financials, and you know, neither Clem nor myself are trying to give advice tonight. We're just trying to educate some of the methodologies that we've used and how we use them to really make it easy for people. And I think really the question that I like to ask, and it's quite a funny story, even to the point where tonight Clem was meant to be sitting at home, and we literally had this all set up and ready to go. And as you said, your internet went down literally, you know, today. And, you know, for me, when one looks at it, success in life is not how well you execute plan A, but effectively it's actually how you execute plan B. And for most of us, we spend 99% of our time in plan B. And my question really to all of you tonight is, how do you actually cope with uncertainty? You know, what does it mean to you? How do you plan? What are your methodologies? How do you actually go out there? Do you have a guaranteed scientific model to be able to look at making the right decisions for you and your family's future? Now, we're not going to give you all the answers tonight, but I wanted to share with you some of the methodology from one of the most respected people, literally globally, in terms of how one can look at different scenarios. You know, you can't just have a plan A. You need a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, depending on what happens in the global scenarios and even in the local scenarios. And a lot of that you don't have a lot of control over. You know, our goal tonight is to really, you know, one of the things that I feel very passionate about is to help people be global citizens. And the question is, well, what is a global citizen? And many different people have many different perspectives. So let's just see and get people engaged. If you go to the chat box, you'll actually be able to type in there what you think it is that is a global citizen. And for me, it's really important. You know, tonight is not one-way communication. We have every intention tonight of interacting, so I'm purposely getting you to find out where the little box is up in the right-hand corner. Go and type in your questions. Go and type in what you think it is to be a global citizen, because tonight we really want to be able to let Clem share, but equally for you to be able to interact and to go and ask a lot of questions. You know, for me, when I look at it, to be a global citizen is ultimately about freedom. It's for you to have the freedom to make the decisions you want for you and your family, where your children go to school, where your children go to university, what country you live in, what job you do, you know, where you donate your money to charity if you want to. Literally the freedom for you to be able to make your own decisions. And really tonight, the whole purpose was to learn from someone with a huge amount of experience in the essence of Clem and how they do their scenario planning, so that you too can have those freedom to be able to make those different decisions based on all the different changes. I know, Clem, that you're going to talk about it a little bit later, but for me, we're also moving into, you know, not only a very, you know, interesting time. There's, you know, the only thing that really people can actually rely on now is that uncertainty and change is pretty much the only certainty. But when you take into account everything happening around the world and you overlay with regards to technology what's happening, it really is, we're in for very interesting times ahead of us. And, you know, this is just some of the stuff. In the last 10 years, it's predicted that 40% of Fortune 500 companies will no longer exist. You know, any company designed for success in the 20th century is doomed for failure in the 21st. And, you know, the question I ask people is that when you talk about it from a company perspective, what about for your personal wealth? What about for your personal, you know, life and how you run your finances? Are they designed for the 20th century or have they been built for the 21st century? You know, when you look at just some of the analogies, whenever technology comes to a space, it has a very, very disruptive element. And it does three things primarily. The first one is that it cuts out the cost. The second one is that it cuts out the middleman. And the third thing is that it dramatically increases the trust, the transparency, and the accessibility. So, I mean, if you look at any of these examples, they're going to have a dramatic impact. And two great examples is Delta Airlines. Delta Airlines was started in 1924. It's the oldest airline in the world. It's the biggest airline in the world. It services over 300 different cities. It's got a valuation of about 17 billion and a staff of over 80,000 people. And yet you compare it to Uber, that now is nearly double Delta in terms of the number of cities it services. It's got a staff component of less than 10,000. Its valuation is $68 billion. And some would argue whether that's overcooked or not. But the most interesting thing is that they don't own one single car. You compare it to Marriott Hotels. It's the biggest hotel group in the world. Again, started in the 1920s. It's worth in the region of about $20 billion. It has 680,000 beds per night, and its staff component is literally in the hundreds of thousands. And you compare it to Airbnb, that literally is now about 1.5 million bed nights, so more than double the size of Marriott. Its valuation is now over $30 billion. And again, its staff component is well less than 5,000. And probably the thing that's most interesting is that it doesn't own one real estate asset. And so what does this all mean, and why is this important? Well, when one considers we've gone through a huge period between linear and exponential, we've gone through a huge period where people haven't understood what's going on. But we're really at this tipping point. And I just wanted to bring this as an introduction because it really kind of sets us up now to be able to move into why this is so important and why you need to understand both Clem and Chantal's methodology so that when you're doing your scenario planning, you can be more effective. Then you start to overlay questions like, what do I actually invest in? Do I invest in real estate, stocks, collectibles, antiques, precious metals? A lot of people are asking me about Bitcoin at the moment. And then you start to overlay, well, what country do I invest in? Do I invest in America? Do I invest in England? Do I invest in Australia? Do I invest in South Africa? People nowadays have so many questions, and rightly so, they should have questions. But for me, this can all get answered, and certainly there's a fantastic methodology that you can learn, and this is really where I wanted to, and very kindly Clem agreed to be part of this tonight, was to really look at what started with the history, and I'll let Clem explain it, where him and Chantal came out with this, and it's now been around for well, I don't want to give the exact time, but it must be nearly 20 years, Clem, the methodology. And just to explain before I hand over to Clem, why I believe this is so important is that most people get to hear, and many of you tonight would have heard Clem's scenarios, you would have heard the flags, but what most people don't do is they don't take that and then use systems. And so for over 5 years, I sat and I analyzed and I watched the way Clem did it. And I then built a model on top of that to help us make better decisions as to where to invest, when to invest, and what to invest in. And, I remember back in 2014 sharing that with Clem, and today this book exists because of it. And Clem very kindly, actually helped me even with I'll never forget, even with the graphs and how some of them should work. But tonight is not about us and what we're doing. It's about you being able to understand the methodology. My request to you, though, tonight is not to just sit back and passively sit there and listen. It's to be able to understand it, try and take notes down, try and create frameworks so that you can make those investment decisions easier. And, like this book, that's what I did. I took down a lot of understanding, trying to understand the flags, how they fitted together, created the methodology to help me be able to make better investment decisions. And like I joked with Clem, this book came out in 2014, and I think the only person who's actually read it is my mother. And really what we did is to take all this information and actually build it into a platform to make it easy for people. But I'll share that later once we've got a much better understanding of the current scenarios. And so, I really wanted to hand over to you, Clem, and start with, the understanding of where this all comes from and what is the difference between, a fox and everything else within the methodology. And just as a setup, I really would like you, if you wouldn't mind, just explaining that methodology and equally what happened in Japan, because I think it's so important for people then to be able to understand that, history repeats itself and people can use this methodology to make the right decisions for themselves. So that's all from me, and it's with huge honor to introduce you, and I really look forward to hearing and learning from you tonight.
Thanks, Scott. And it's an absolute pleasure to be with you again, and I really enjoyed helping you with your book, and if people haven't read it, they should jolly well go out and buy a copy or get one on the internet. Yeah, we called the book, and it was published in June 2001, The Mind of a Fox, for two reasons. The first was that you've really got to have the bright eyes of a fox to survey the environment, particularly the markets which you're involved in, and try and make out what are the flags that are changing the game in those markets. And secondly, what are the possibilities that actually flow out of the flag? So you've got to have very sharp eyes to be ahead of your competitors. But secondly, you've got to respond, as you just said. You've got to have that agility of a fox when you've spotted a change in the game to actually say, here's an opportunity, I'm going to grab it, or indeed, here's a threat, and I'm going to avoid it. And so that's why we called the book The Mind of a Fox, because there are two things about the future which are essentially given forever. Firstly, it's unpredictable, and therefore you have to play the scenarios. And secondly, you've got so many things that you don't control that the only thing you do is your response to the changes in events, and that's why you have to have that agility. So over the last few years, I've been gathering from clients and obviously in conversations with Chantel, what are the kind of flags that are changing the global game at the moment? And the first one was one which we put in the book, which was the religious flag. We actually wrote a letter to George Bush, which was published in the book, remembering it was published in June 2001. And we said that his principal risk at the time was a massive terrorist strike on an American city. And it happened 3 months after we published the book on the 11th of September. And yeah, I mean, when they did a literature search, we were the only authors who actually captured that possibility, because terrorism was never mentioned in the election at the end of 2001, when Bush and Al Gore were competing with one another. It just wasn't on the radar screen. And we had it as a flag because, of course, there was a lot of build-up during the 1990s of conflict between different religions, and there were certainly capabilities becoming apparent in places like Afghanistan of doing nasty things to America. So it was a prime example of picking up a flag. And it's not that we knew it would happen 3 months after we published the book. You know, you'd have to have inside information for that. But the fact is that people like the CIA and the FBI should have been more aware of the very specific flags that they should have been looking for prior to 9/11. And indeed, there was one woman in the FBI who actually said that there was a flying school down the road from her office where Arabs were being taught to take off but not land. Now, that is a huge flag if you'd had the more general flag in mind that there could be a terrorist attack, and they could have acted on it. So it really bore out our methodology. Obviously, that particular flag is still flying with the lone wolf attacks that you see in France and Britain and elsewhere. It's certainly made intelligence a much more complex activity and more expensive. And the terrible thing is that it has turned several Middle Eastern countries into failed states, such as Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Iraq and Afghanistan are still questionable countries. So that flag, unfortunately, is still flying. The second one that has come out in all our work is what we call the red flag. It was really the invasion of the Crimea by Russia and the appropriation of the port and surrounding territory, which has meant we're into the second Cold War between Russia and America. And it has made things like Syria more dangerous because you might have a direct confrontation between America and Russia. But now, of course, you've got North Korea that has entered the fray, and there's a very specific flag which Donald Trump has raised, which is they mustn't go ahead with another nuclear bomb test. the sixth test, because he will take action. We don't know what type of action he's going to take, but obviously it's a flag to watch because it potentially could cause huge disruption in places like South Korea, China, which is close, and obviously Russia too. So, you know, once it's on your radar screen, you read every bit of news around that particular flag. The third flag we talked about, Scott, you know, when we last got together, which is the grey flag of the aging of certain populations in the world, which means that their economies are relatively flat. And the one which you have up there of Japan, I remember my mentor, a Frenchman called Pierre Wack, saying in 1988 that that if there was a property crash in Japan, it would never recover again because it was the oldest country in the world. And indeed, that property crash happened in 1990, and Japan has never seen the incredible economic growth rates that they had in the 70s and 80s. And why is that important? Because China now is an aging society, and that is why the Chinese economy is slowing down. They've tried to overcome that by saying that they've revised the one-child policy to a two-child policy, but that's not going to impact the economy for the next 15 years. And therefore, we're living in a world of an aging China, which is slowing down, and basically Europe and Japan are going to remain relatively flat economies. America is younger and more resilient, and of course, where there's good government in the rest of the world, you can still have relatively high economic growth rates. So the grey flag, it's a clockwork flag ticking away, but it should affect your investment decisions. The next...
Clem, one thing quickly that you spoke about with Japan that I always enjoyed was that your mentor actually said in 1988 it was going to happen, and the way that he predicted it was that golf club memberships were going down dramatically, and therefore people were, you know, holding back a bit. And you know, these are the type of flags that you're talking about that people can watch out for and start to be able to see so that they can predict what's going to happen, basically.
Absolutely, and I mean, it's often a fairly minor flag, and it was because golf was such a passion in Japan at the time that, you know, any decline in membership meant that there had been a real tipping point in people's fortunes, particularly middle class and rich people in Japan. And it was, in retrospect, a brilliant flag because it really said there is going to be something happening to property, because if you remember in the late 80s, property was totally overvalued in Japan. The Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the entire state of California. So it was a bubble that was going to burst, and it was golf club membership that gave that indication that it could burst. The next flag is an interesting one that, again, I referred to in a book that I wrote in November, not last year, the previous year, which I called flag watching, and it was what I called the anti-establishment flag, the fact that electorates around the world were getting absolutely fed up with politicians and, you know, the traditional political parties. And this isn't a clockwork flag. This is very cloudy. It's produced consequences which I certainly wouldn't have anticipated, such as Brexit. I mean, it really was the north of England voting against the politicians, and of course the charisma of Boris Johnson in the Leave campaign that led to Brexit. But of course, it's just produced the opposite result in France with Macron being elected president, who's very pro the EU. The exact opposite of the Leavers in the UK. So, you know, a flag can have absolute opposite consequences in two different situations. And of course, it produced Donald Trump. He basically got a lot of American votes because he wasn't part of the political establishment. So it just shows that once you've established that there is a general flag, which we call the anti-establishment flag, it really is important then to say what could the narrative be flowing out of the flag, both the kind of positive and negative narratives. And as I said, it can be completely different consequences in different countries. So very interesting flag. And of course, Brexit could really impact on London property values, particularly at the premium end. I mean, I've heard of an example of a house that was put on the market in Notting Hill Gate for £4 million and actually sold about a month later for 3.2 million. So that indicates maybe a 20% drop in premium property values in London. And in fact, in the paper today, there was an article that 9,000 jobs could disappear in the banking industry in London because those functions are going to have to be transferred to Europe as part of the as part of the deal, in the sense that banks have to now do the work in Europe rather than from London. So very important flag for the consequences that may happen to property. The green flag is one that has been flying a long time. I saw President Obama ex-President Obama talking today at some climate change conference, and you know, it's one unfortunately that Donald Trump does not agree with. But when you've got a flag on your mind, you look at news which either supports it or is against it. And there was an article about 3 weeks ago that by 2050 the Arctic ice will have virtually disappeared, and that will open up completely new shipping routes around the north of Canada and the north of Russia, which simply hasn't been possible in the history of this planet, but which will become possible in the second half of this century. It does also mean that you'll have beneficiaries like Canada and Russia, because there will be less snow, less ice, and they will become more arable. But countries in Africa, as well as America and South America, may well become drier and hotter, which could have a big consequence for agricultural yields. Sea levels may well rise as a result of the melting of Antarctica and Greenland, and of course that's going to affect global cities. I was in Amsterdam last year doing some work for some clients, and they are well aware of this, and of course they've had the flood defense system in Amsterdam for centuries, and they said that places like London and Los Angeles and obviously the coastal cities in Australia may well have to do more in terms of flood defense as a result of this flag. And the other important point to bear in mind is that weather is becoming more extreme because of the additional energy in the atmosphere. So you have droughts like you had in California, but then they're followed by record rainfall. So you've now got to be careful where you buy your property because of the record rainfall, as people on the Thames found 2 years ago.
So what you're saying, Clem, is saying is I'm in trouble because I'm living on Teeson Island here in Knysna. I need to buy myself a life raft.
Yeah, well, no, it's obviously got to be borne in mind with coastal properties. It's obviously not going to happen overnight. I mean, the latest estimate is that I think by the end of this century, sea levels could be 0.5 meter higher. So you know, it's a very gradual process. National debt is definitely a little clockwork flag ticking away in the background. I don't know of a country that's running a surplus, budget surplus at the moment. Obviously, interest rates are virtually zero, so most countries can afford to increase the national debt. But if interest rates start to rise, then that's going to become a problem. And of course, there are certain countries like Greece and Italy, which one watches very closely because national debt as a percentage of GDP is way up. I mean, it's around 200% of GDP in Greece and around 150% of GDP in Italy. So, you know, the EU in 5 years' time could become financially fragile. The next flag that came up really in a meeting I had with Interpol, of all organizations, in Paris in 2009, when I asked them what were the biggest threats to the world at the time. They named a threat which was certainly not on my radar screen, which was porous borders. The idea that you know, borders were no longer properly patrolled and that people could actually get into virtually any country in the world if they really wish to. And of course, that is a huge issue today. It's why many British people voted for Brexit. In fact, again, a piece of news that's come out in the last 2 days is that 6,000 people were rescued in the Mediterranean in the last 2 days, trying to get from Africa to Europe. So again, there's going to be a real problem for countries that are actually holding these refugees, but of course there's going to continue to be pressure of migrants into countries that they see as relatively rich and prosperous. The world of work, which you mentioned, has been changed by technology. Uber, very good example, Airbnb, where you have very few permanent employees. It's more of a network where people are using their assets, either their car or their house, to make money, and the company itself is providing that particular network, so the official number of employees is much lower. And so it's meant for young people that it is a completely different game now getting a job to what it was in the 70s and 80s, when you know, you basically got a good school qualification, and then if you're lucky, a good degree, and then you just waved your CV and you got a job. Nowadays, young people have to create work for themselves, and it's a whole new game, and you've got to teach people how to be entrepreneurs. And there are very, very few schools here in South Africa, but elsewhere in Europe and Britain, America, that are actually teaching kids how to run real businesses. So they haven't adapted like foxes to the changing nature of work, which is going to intensify as technology becomes smarter, and of course with artificial intelligence. One of those technologies. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to butt in there. I know you and I spoke about it before. We were just in the setup phase 3 years ago, but we actually launched Lemonade Day here in South Africa. It's that charity organization, NGO, that's out of America, that's backed by Google for Entrepreneurs. And it actually trains children in how to run a business, entrepreneurship skills, through running a Lemonade Day stand. And we run a bunch of pilots here in South Africa, and got some incredible stories of young South African kids, Africans, whites, all different backgrounds. And really, I feel so strongly about what you say. I truly believe the only future we've got, if we all want to live in this country, is by empowering the children with access to entrepreneurship education. And so, yeah, I just want to let you know. I'm not sure if I let you know, but 3 years ago we were talking about it, but we've done it now, and it's amazing. The results are incredible, you know. And watching the children, there's one little guy called Bongi that you know, literally wanted to go to a private school, and through this whole experience, it's changed his entire life. He's currently at a private school, and he's in control of his own destiny at the age of 14.
Yeah, and you know what? You've got, I don't know, a youth unemployment rate here of 50%. I hear in France that the youth unemployment rate is 25%. It's certainly 50% in Greece and Spain. And, you know, it just means that if you're a young person nowadays, you've got to learn to create a job for yourself. It's an absolutely critical skill. And yet very few schools have recognized this flag. And I guess it's because the teaching profession simply don't do that kind of serious research into how markets are changing and adapt their product, the educational product, like foxes should. And so a program like the Lemonade program is exactly what kids have to do in order to get a real feel for what it's like to start a business in the outside world.
Yeah, I know that it's essential.
Yeah, the last two flags, internet and cellular mobile phone flag, and you know, it's having some really interesting consequences like fake news. And you know, you've got to be careful when you pick up flags on the internet and in social networks to check out their authenticity. And I see that there's a lot of pressure being put on Facebook and Twitter and the big networks to actually ensure that somehow fake news is exposed. And the last flag, which has been raised by some of our clients, is this whole lifestyle and leisure flag. The fact that nowadays people have less time to enjoy things like sport. Bringing up kids tends to be a joint activity, so you don't have people going off at 8 o'clock in the morning to play golf and coming home at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, like you did in the last century, and therefore golf actually has been declining in popularity in America, to the point that some clubs are saying that they've got to make the holes bigger. So the actual experience of playing around is shorter, because you can get your ball into the hole that much easier. But I last year had to do a conversation in a new Audi which was being promoted, the Q7, with Hashim Amla, and he was saying that Test cricket is now under huge pressure because people simply don't have the time to take off to go and watch Test cricket. And he actually said that maybe you've got to have a sort of World Test Cricket Cup or something to make Test cricket popular again. But he said, you know, everybody's moved towards the T20 format. I saw he scored 100 in his last Indian Premier League game, good old Hashim. But you know, that's where the money is nowadays. So again, it's a very good example how once you've established that's a flag, that people have changed their attitude towards time, lifestyle, and leisure, that you then decide what formats of sport are going to be popular, and obviously what other activities might become popular. I mean, cycling now is one of the most popular sports in the world, because of course you choose the time when you go out and choose the time when you come back. It's got a flexibility that a game like golf simply doesn't have. So you know, those are the kind of flags. I'm sure that listeners will have other flags which we haven't recognized, but I'm just trying to get across, Scott, that you know, it's really important as a first step to say, what are the flags changing my business, my life? Not necessarily all the global flags I'm talking about, but the particular flags that really interest me. And as I say to young people, you know, one of the best flags when you're making a strategic decision to select a spouse is to look at the parents, because that's a flag. What that's they might be when they're older. So it's actually trying to select the flags which are really important for your business, your family, your life. Not necessarily doing all the stuff that I've gone through. Obviously, those flags are important for the global economy, but it's what are the game-changing flags? And we have the two types: the clockworks ones, which are ticking away, like the grey flag of the aging of the world's population. But equally, you have the kind of cloudy flags, like the anti-establishment flag, producing Brexit, Trump, and now Macron in France, who really has had no political experience whatsoever. So, yeah, it's certainly become very...
Just quickly here, Clem, two things. One is that quite a few people have said, thanks for the tip on the partner, but it's a bit late. Wish they'd heard you say that before. But on a more serious note, you know, just an analogy, just a metaphor I've used when I first heard about your flags, and you know that I've explained to others just so that they understand, is that the analogy I often use is the beach. And you know, I always say to people from Gauteng, you know, this could actually save their lives. That if they're down in, you know, Cape Town and they're swimming in Fishhook or Camps Bay or somewhere, and you know, if they see the white flag come out, they need to get out of the water because ultimately there's a shark. And whereas if it's a green flag, that they can stay swimming. And I joke with people, but I think everyone understands sharks and they will understand danger. And there's very few people that stay in the water when they get told to get out because there's a shark. And I think the point being is that, you know, this is obviously just a typical beach scenario. But what you're saying is that there's some big, really important flags. And then equally, there's some more minor flags. And then even people have them in their personal life. But the philosophy I always use is just the flag analogy to explain what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And you ignore them at your peril, as some surfers have found. So, yeah, nice example. I'll certainly use that in future. Um, so, what are the scenarios that flow out of these flags for the global economy? I think the one that we're in, and the one that we give the highest probability to, given these flags, I call ultraviolet. It's a UV scenario where we're in a divided world, and we're more divided now than we were 20 or 30 years ago. In the sense that national priorities have come to the fore with Donald Trump, obviously with Brexit, and now, of course, animosities between Russia and America, and North Korea. And so there's this kind of UV world, ultraviolet world, where some economies are going through a long U of low economic growth. And as I mentioned, because of the grey flag, I would put Europe and Japan into those categories. And then, of course, you have a mild V, because it's not a full recovery in the world, but a mild V in the sense of quite high economic growth rates in China. And I would put America in that category because they have a younger, more resilient population. And then, of course, there are certain economies in Africa and South America and elsewhere in the world, like Singapore, which good, well-governed countries and young populations which are also have high economic growth. And we give that scenario for the next 5 years around about an 80% probability. So it's a question of choosing which countries are in that sort of V category. And of course, it does mean for South Africa that it's a relatively tough world compared to conditions in the last 20 years of the last century, when it was pretty much a boom everywhere. Now you've got to be more selective. On the upside, there is a recovery, a boom scenario, but the big flag to watch for that is a new technology, because there was a Russian economist who put his finger on it a long time ago when he said every 60 years you have a new technology and that creates a global boom. And he went back to steel, and then how steel led to railways, and railways to electricity, and then the internal combustion engine, and obviously planes, and then we moved into microelectronics, computers, internet, smart devices. And if you think about it, that was the 50s when microelectronics started, so we're 60 years, more than 60 years down the road. One's looking for the next technology. Our scenario team in the 70s thought biotechnology would take over from microelectronics as the main driver of growth. But unfortunately, biotech products, particularly pharmaceuticals, have really been too pricey to become popular like mobile phones. And so we're yet to see the kind of real growth in aggregate demand that you need to create a global boom out of a single technology like biotech. The other technology is renewable energy, and again, there's lots of reasons, such as the green flag of climate change, that it should become popular. But most companies in the renewable energy field have not yet become like Apple and created sort of $600 million of profit. I mean, Solar City, which is the largest solar cell manufacturer in the United States, owned by Elon Musk, is basically battling at the moment. Even though he's produced the batteries to hang on the wall and the panels to put on your roof, he hasn't made a huge profit out of it. I have to say that the one area where it's exciting is that Tesla has overtaken General Motors in terms of market capitalization because of the orders for the Tesla 3. So, essentially, the real flag for a kind of new economic boom is not about monetary policy and zero interest rates. It's about a new technology which has the potential to really grow like microelectronics, computers, and smart devices. So we give that a 10% probability at the moment because we're just not convinced that that technology is around quite yet.
Can I ask you a quick question there, Clem? Two questions. One is that, you know, I had the privilege of studying at Singularity University last year, which is one of the leading exponential technologies around the world. And one of the things they spoke about in 2016 that was really important is that when one looks at renewable energy, and particularly when one looks at solar, it's actually gone through the inflection point now where the cost to produce the solar, you know, the infrastructure to be able to take solar is actually now going to be cheaper for renewables than it is actually for fossil fuels. And one of they believe that 2016 is that tipping point. They talk about the 6 Ds of disruption, but I won't go into those details, but they believe last year was the year that it actually hit that inflection point. I'm not sure, are you aware of that, or I'm just interested because, you know, now you can really start to scale, you know?
Absolutely, and that is the key thing, because the technology is there. It's really about price. In fact, quite a few governments, like the German government, the Australian government, are offering incentives for people to go the renewable energy route, and any surplus electricity that you produce with your renewable energy system in your house is actually sold into the national grid. So yeah, it can take off. Interestingly, the thing that came up when I raised the point that you did, talking to a scientist really involved in the renewable energy field, is that the thing that's the key now is how many times a battery can be recharged, the one that you hang on your wall, because, you know, at the moment they haven't got the sort of lithium and other metal composition right for it to last, you know, a proper length of time. So it's not just the actual price, it's, you know, how often you have to replace.
One other quick question just before we move on is that quite a few people beat me to it, but when one looks at technology, and you know, now you're really talking in a space I enjoy, and you know, for me, you think that those technology, I'm not sure how much you know about blockchain, but a lot of people talk about blockchain having a bigger impact than the internet at large. And equally on top of that, possibly even artificial intelligence. Like, are there any technologies that you're watching that has the ability to be that 60-year change that like the microelectronics?
Well, you see, and this is my point, is that, you know, all the ones that you've just mentioned are part of the whole microelectronics boom, which led to internet, to smart devices, to apps, and so for me, that's all part of the same S-curve, and the real kind of steep part of that S-curve was essentially in the last 10 years of the last century, and maybe the first 10 years of this century. It's basically satisfying a different human need. I mean, if you look back to the 18th century, it was all about travel and you know, steam engines, and then it obviously developed into other forms of travel, and then you had manufacturing of clothes as opposed to people hand weaving clothes, and so, you know, it's all about saying which is the next human need which is going to be satisfied in a very smart way, which people haven't thought about. So yes, we can talk about a lot of exciting things in the you know, the software and internet field, but, you know, what one is looking for is something that's very different, that hasn't yet really taken off, because, you know, that's why computers became such a huge thing, is nobody had actually thought of computers before they actually arrived, and when they did arrive, nobody thought of personal computers, and then nobody thought of smartphones until Steve Jobs came along. And maybe there are one or two huge products still to come, but in terms of technologies, one's really looking for something different, like renewable energy, or possibly medicine, which it comes out of the sort of biotech pharmaceutical side. But at the moment, we only give a 10% probability. I mean, I see that we were giving it a slightly higher, sorry, but round about to the new balls, please, boom scenario. And of course, there's fork lightning, and the real flags for the fork lightning, another crash scenario, are rising interest rates and rising national debt. And that's what created the crisis in 2007 with subprime mortgages, and it could easily create a problem with subprime national debt. And so that's the flag that we ask people to watch. At the moment it's down because interest rates are still virtually zero. But absolutely, if inflation starts really rising in the UK or America or Europe, that would be the first flag, because then you have to raise interest rates, and interest rates will just make all that national debt more difficult to service and repay. So that 15% probability you've got on that chart is probably correct. And we've moved, as I said, the more ultraviolet scenario, because the world is definitely more divided than when we did that chart. And that's why I don't really speak about hard times anymore, because the world is split between the kind of winners and losers. And we think that's going to be the scenario.
I think, Clem, just for everyone who's online, you know, I took this off your website, and it was the latest kind of nice graph that I'm a very visual person. So even though the scenarios have changed, I think that's the whole reason that people need to be not only hearing this for the first time, but doing it on a regular basis. So please understand, people that are seeing this visually, these scenarios have changed. I mean, this is 3 years old, but I think the framework's the same, and now people can just put in different statistics, if you want to call it that, different scenario statistics, probabilities.
And look, there's two things about this, is that absolutely, this particular scenario game board is brought out regularly by companies once every quarter to discuss which flags have gone up, which have gone down, and therefore have the probabilities changed, and if the probabilities have changed, how have they adapted their strategy in order to cope with the rising probability in a particular scenario or the falling probability in another scenario. And so this particular chart is used regularly for the kind of conversation that you talked about, as is the one which I'm going to talk about for South Africa, and how much money you should have locally and how much money you should have overseas. Which really brings on to South Africa, which is what are the flags that our clients in South Africa have been talking about in strategy sessions. And we've got 8 flags. The first one is corruption, because people are really worried with the level of corruption in South Africa, because the end game is very visible in Venezuela, which is having regular riots, and people are starving in a country that was once one of the great hopes of South America because of its oil production. Brazil is another country which was considered a sort of South American version of an Asian tiger, but again, because of corruption, has now become a problem economy. I would say this flag is not red, because there's a lot of pushback against it. We have a free media in South Africa, and we have independent institutions like the Constitutional Court, which are sort of pushing back against corruption. So it's for me a kind of pink flag at the moment, and you've obviously got to go on watching the ongoing battle between, you know, corrupt acts and obviously the agencies which are pushing back on that. The second is quality of infrastructure, because that really hit me in China in April 2006, when I was asked to do a scenario session with the Chinese Communist Party at the Central Party School in Beijing. And, you know, they said that one of the critical success factors in China had been the success in establishing the road system, the rail system, electricity, building power plants, commissioning them every single month, and that had given them the real platform on which to have an economic growth rate of 8 to 10%. And I have to say, India, which in many ways I think is more entrepreneurial than China and may well overtake China one day, but they haven't got that quality of infrastructure right. And in this country, you know, there's upsides and downsides. Some of our cities have pretty good infrastructure, but as one CEO said at a session the other day, in parts of South Africa, you don't drive on the left of the road, you drive on what's left of the road. So yeah, you know, it's an essential feature of a successful economy to have quality infrastructure, and so the performance of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, is a critical flag in future. And of course, we know of quite a few SOEs who are in pretty dismal shape, or at least their boards are in pretty dismal shape in South Africa at the moment. The third flag is around style of leadership and whether it's divisive. And I think it's become much more divisive now than it was under Nelson Mandela, who I had the privilege of seeing in prison when he wanted to talk about scenarios about a month before he was released. And he really showed true reconciliation in his conversation with me, and he showed it as the leader of South Africa. And we haven't got that at the moment. We have expressions like white monopoly capital and this and that and everything else. And actually, you want to win in the world economy, you've got to be a united team. And if you're not a united team, you don't win. And I think the one example I always produce is that under Alex Ferguson, Manchester United was united and won all the trophies. And ever since he's gone, they've never had that unity of spirit. And so, yeah, they're still to this day not doing that well. And I say that as a fan of Chelsea. Who I'm going to say is going to win the Premier League.
Little dig for all the people online tonight.
Well, I was brought up in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, so I have every right to be a Chelsea supporter. I have to tell you, there's still in the Chelsea ground is a place called the Shed, which is where the real Chelsea fans go. And I remember in the late 50s, early 60s, the fighting got so bad in the Shed that they confiscated our belts as we went into the ground, so that you had to hold up your trousers during the game. You couldn't have any fisticuffs, and then you had to recover your belt at the end of the game from this vast mountain. So actually, you ended up with somebody else's belt. Anyway, that's wow. Just a small story. But style of leadership, very important. And so really, it's the question of who's going to be the next leader of South Africa. And is that person going to be, you know, a unifier, whether it's Dlamini Zuma or whether it's Cyril Ramaphosa? That person has got to bring more unity to the country if you want to get a 3 to 5% economic growth rate. The fourth flag is around pockets of excellence, and the fact that we have incredible pockets of excellence in South Africa. And if you have the money, you can live a life which is just as good as it is in anywhere in the world, in America, the UK, Australia. It's how do we replicate our pockets of excellence? The last thing we should do is dumb them down. And I always refer to schools. We have 28,000 schools in this country, of which 5,000 are excellent and 23,000 are moderate to dismal. How do we take the bad schools and upgrade them to the quality that you get in the good schools? And that is a serious flag to consider. Entrepreneurial spark, because of the quality of work, the world of work. How do we create 1 million new businesses in South Africa? Because given the changing nature of work, you need a million businesses to create 5 million jobs. It's not about big businesses taking on or doubling their staff. That's never going to happen again. It's about how we create an immense number of new businesses and have the environment to do that. And one thing I always say to people is it's entrepreneurs that change nations. It's not politicians. I mean, James Watt changed the UK because he was the inventor of the steam engine, and William Pitt, who was a very famous politician, he was there to sort of create a decent playing field, but it was James Watt who changed the UK. And of course, in America, you've had the likes of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and now Elon Musk, who are providing that entrepreneurial spark. The sixth flag is one which is related to the first one, the independence of the judiciary and other institutions, and that has really come through. It's a very green flag for South Africa. And of course, we have the independence of the media as well. So long may that flag stay raised. The seventh flag is a very red flag. It's nationalization of the banks and the mines and other industries, which would be sort of considered one way to go about radical economic transformation. It hasn't worked in any country, and that's why the Russians have moved away from it, the Chinese have moved away from it. It simply doesn't work. Politicians are not good at running businesses. They must leave it to the entrepreneurs. And anyway, the state should not be involved in taking the risk in businesses. I mean, take over the mines, you're going to inherit the risk of the mines when you should be spending taxpayer money on schools and hospitals and other things like that. The last flag that has been raised is also a very critical flag around land ownership, because if you go around about land ownership in the wrong way, with a sort of forceful appropriation of land with no compensation and of course invading land, it could lead to a civil war in this country. So yes, land ownership has to change in this country, but it's got to be a change that is agreed by the parties. I believe we need an agridessa, a sort of an agricultural CODESA to negotiate this, because we have very skewed land ownership in this country. But for example, I believe that we should have the same model that we have in business, which is mixed ownership of a company, and therefore, you know, farmers should be considering, you know, creating companies in which share capital is shared with their workers. And I know that quite a few farmers have gone this route, and it certainly works. And we've got to look at innovative ways of creating a much higher percentage of black land ownership, but not in a way that either causes a civil war or indeed leads to a drop in the food production, because then our food security then becomes a big issue. What does this create in terms of scenarios for South Africa? Well, three. The first one we call Premier League. It's where we're competitive and essentially we have achieved internal harmony. It is a scenario we've been in because for the last 150 years we've been the largest economy in Africa. Now we're being rivaled by Egypt and Nigeria, and we're in the relegation zone given the recent downgrading of our currency to junk status and our very low economic growth rate. Yeah, we're in the relegation of the Premier zone of the Premier League, which you have on that chart. The second division is where we don't turn those flags, which I mentioned, green, and we peacefully fall into the second division, where we really become just another badly run African country. I mean, on our borders, interestingly, are two African countries which are very well run. Botswana, I did a session with the president of Botswana and the National Economic Advisory Council a year ago. What a well-run country. And the other is Namibia. I've done quite a lot of work in Namibia, and you know, the South Africans who are expatriates in Windhoek have all said they're never coming back to South Africa because they just love the fact that Namibia is peaceful by comparison, and you just get on with the job in Namibia. And indeed, I had lunch with the First Lady there, Mrs. Geingob, who's a very, very switched on business lady. And yeah, you know, there are examples in Africa of countries that are, whose ambition is to get into the Premier League and away from the second division. Obviously, you can't be competitive if you have internal conflict, so we rule out that scenario altogether. And failed state, yeah, that's the scenario where public violence reaches a level that we're seen in the same light as Syria, Somalia, yeah, countries where there is a high degree of violence and people are not prepared to go and visit because they don't want to be killed as tourists. In our case, I have to say the tourist industry is booming in Cape Town, because it's not seen as a dangerous place to visit, and it's very cheap by global standards. So obviously a failed state is where tourism virtually drops to zero, and obviously a lot of businesses move outside South Africa because they don't want to risk their employees, and of course people don't want to risk their own families. Now, in that slide, Chantal and I gave it a 25% probability, but we've reduced that because of the green flag of the independence of the judiciary and other institutions, and we're seeing the pushback, and we're seeing a genuine desire to try and create an alternative economic model. As I said, if it's based on nationalization, that would be a red flag. So essentially, the failed state scenario, we would keep it a sort of 10 to 15% probability. But Premier League, we would now have around 30% because of the downgrading, and second division around about 60%. So we've unfortunately had to lower the probability on staying in the Premier League. And as I said, you've got to consider as a fox how you adapt your strategy as a business in terms of diversification around the world in order to cope with the greater risks of falling into the second division. So there you go, Scott. That's the flags and the scenarios, and I'm open for any questions that you'd like to raise.
Oh wow, there are a lot of questions that's come through. So I'm going to try and figure out how to do this. One quick just before we get started on the questions. One thing that I remember very, it was a very important lesson that I learned from you years ago, and you spoke quite a lot around two things. One is on the whole basis we were talking earlier before we started on the difference between kind of unsophisticated investors and sophisticated investors, and the real understanding between income and capital growth. And you had two stories. One was your family home in England, and also the stock market over the last 100 years. And I'd love you just to share that while I just look through these questions and see where to get started.
Yeah, the property in the UK was my mother was brought up in the most beautiful house in Camden Hill, which is in Kensington, where I was also brought up, but not in that house. The family decided to sell it in the mid-30s for around £35,000, and then it was sold to a Russian in 2013 for £17 million. It's one of the finest properties, I have to say, which is close to Holland Park. And you might say, wow, you should have held on to that property. And being an only child of my mother, I often said exactly that to her. But if you look at the compound interest rate that gets you from 35,000 to 70 million in that space of time of 77 years, it's 10%. It's it's not that high, 10%. And indeed, if you look at the 100-year Dow, it's also around 10%. It's just a little bit below 10%. But the critical thing about the Dow Jones Industrial Average in America, creating that almost 10% compound growth rate per annum, is that two-thirds of that growth was dividends and the reinvestment of those dividends, and so it's overlooked by a lot of investors that actually dividends really count, and in terms of your wealth strategy, you mustn't just look at capital gain. You've got to look at dividends.
So I mean that leads in really well, because I think for me, I learned that, well, not only from yourself, it's really interesting. If you read Warren Buffett's book, he invests for the same reason, for income, and then even from my uncle, when we were in the middle of the crash, I asked him why he invested in Coca-Cola, and he said, well, Coca-Cola is in 100+ countries and different currencies, and quite frankly, it pays a dividend. And I was like, oh wow, starting to notice a massive trend here. I just wanted to share with people just quickly, there's a lot of questions that I wanted to run through, but really what I tried to do many years ago now is to take a lot of what Clem said and then start to have scenarios and what I called in those days a probability calculator. Now, this is not necessarily right or wrong. It's just merely a framework. And what it allows you to do is it starts to help you make decisions as to where you should invest between local versus offshore, and equally even between different countries. And I mean, these graphs are these specific graphs I've got are from my book, and I've purposely put them in there because they'll be the same as in my book. But obviously, I've learned tonight, just like all of you have learned from Clem, in terms of some of the different scenarios, some of the different flags. What I need to go back now is then go and actually plug in the models and really be able to take people through it. And I'm going to mention it later, but we've got a bunch of events in May that I'll be doing around the country. It's the 25th of May in Johannesburg, the 30th of May in Durban, and the 1st of June in Cape Town. And I'll then be taking people live through this so that we can actually look at some of the methodology in terms of where it is. So, as Clem said, should you be investing in America? Is it England? Is it Australia? Is it South Africa? Plus, many, many other countries. And I think the methodology is that you need to be able to have systems. And so, taking into account everything that Clem said, we then have built the systems and the methodology which helps us decide where do we invest, when do we invest, what countries do we invest in, what do you invest in, do you invest in different asset classes, etc. And I'm not going to go through it tonight, but I am going to spend a lot of time at the event talking through our GIDS process and the global investment due diligence system and how it actually works. And this is what Clem was referring to, that where he actually helped me visually make this easier for people to understand. But you put in all the fundamentals, you take the scenarios, and the one thing I've learned about investment is that things don't change. The numbers might change, just like what Clem's showing you with the flags might change, but the fundamentals of investing don't change. And so what this allows people to do is then go and actually be able to change it and to look, where should I be investing based on risk and return, etc. And there's many methodologies, and again, I'm not going to go through it in detail tonight in terms of how one actually does this. And I really want to share with people so that they can empower themselves to be able to make the right decisions. And like I joked right in the beginning, this stuff is all in our books. This is a 100-layer multi-system that looks at which country, which suburbs, are they close to education, the property features, etc. And what I really realized is that most people don't have time to read books anymore. And systems like from Dr. Dolph de Roos, if you've come across this book, and I know, Clem, you've shared the stage many times with Dr. Dolph de Roos, one of the most respected people in the world when it comes to real estate investing. And these are some of the models he uses in terms of looking at properties. There's 142 level due diligence in terms of, again, if you're thinking of investing in London or in the USA, okay, how do you actually know which is the right property, in terms of the experience? And I think what I just wanted to show you quickly before I take questions is that, we've used this methodology. I've been investing overseas now since 1999, and really, Clem really helped me enhance this. But when one looks at the different markets, there's a good time to be in a market and there's a bad time to be in a market. And what a lot of people tend to find is that, whether they're investing in South Africa or whether they're investing in London, you tend to get promoted by someone that all that they know is that market. And they'll tend to tell you, whether it's the stock market or the property market or the bond market, they tend to just tell you, well, that's always the best. And there's never a bad time in their mind, which I completely disagree with. Timing is everything, and that's why the scenario planning and flags are so important. And I really wanted to share with people, just some of the track record around, being in different markets at different times, being able to diversify across different markets. And really, also when one looks at returns, when one looks, purely just at some of the listed markets, you can go back and you can look at track record. And again, for me, it's all good and well to have theories and systems and assessments, but the question is, are they actually working? And you can see here some returns that our investors have been getting over the last couple of years in medical buildings in America. I know, Clem, you spoke quite a lot in the past around America, and some of that you've spoken tonight as well around there's two things in America when you look at this. This is medical buildings in America. So not only are you in an economy where, as Clem says, it's one of the more positive economies around the world, but also, if you take the grey flag, it's an aging population. So there's more and more, impact on medical. And, these are some of the trends that we focus on. And I mean, we've got over $100 million now in medical just in Atlanta alone. And, there's a whole lot of reasons and methodologies as to why we do this. And I'm not going to bore you, but you can generally see the returns are over 8% cash on cash. That's not taking into account capital growth. That's not taking into account rand devaluation. That's purely cash on cash returns in dollars. And a lot of people say to me, what's the difference between that and a REIT? And I go, well, if you look at any REIT in America, the average REIT is earning between 4.5% and 5%. And why this is important is that, I fundamentally believe that the market has really shifted. There was an old way of doing things where people really didn't have the time, the money, and quite frankly, the accessibility. And there were a huge amount of middlemen, a lot of costs and a lot of fees. And people now have the ability to be able to go in and to be able to get access to some of the better opportunities around the world, but without all the middlemen, and being able to get access to people like Clem in terms of the technologies. And when one looks at real estate, most people have tended to be very local. Even if they're from Joburg, they tend to invest in Joburg. If they're from Cape Town, they invest in Cape Town. They really haven't gone offshore because it's really difficult. People are stuck in country. It's really difficult. There's huge barriers to entry. They don't get access to good opportunities, and that's not even taking into account the legal, the trust, and the partners. And something I'm quite excited just to share with you quickly, Clem, before we get into those questions, is that there's a lot of technology players that have gone out there, fintech platforms that are really disrupting a $13 trillion market. But when you're South African, you can never focus on just one market. And so we really set about to be that global solution and to provide people with that global opportunity. And without getting into too much detail, the question we asked ourselves years ago was, how can we really make global real estate easy? And today, I'm quite proud of the fact from a team perspective that people can now invest literally, whether they want to do it on their mobile phones or whether they want to be able to do it online. They can literally invest in a couple of minutes. They can literally sit on their couch and invest in a couple of minutes around the world globally. And they can get access to the best partners, the best opportunities, and literally from as little as $1,000. And so, in the past, it was all about, hassles and management issues and complex tax structures. And now they can literally just focus on the best returns. And, if I share with you quickly here, this is the front end that people can go into. But more importantly, if they go in the back end, and, from my perspective here, if I just log in quickly, I just actually want to share this with you, Clem, because I don't think you've actually seen this either, where I can now, it was a childhood dream where I could literally play global Monopoly. And why this is so important is that when I look at your scenarios, for me, what is critically important is that, one needs to be able to diversify. One needs to be able to look at all the different scenarios in terms of what is happening and how is it actually happening. And I think when one really looks at the opportunities, one now needs to be able to invest in multiple different markets and not basically get caught up in just being stuck in one country, one asset class, or one currency. And so I'm just logging in here quickly. It logged me out for some reason. Oh, I've forgotten my login details. 2 seconds. And what one really gets when one logs in is it ultimately gives you the ability to be able to invest and to really be able to start looking at one's. What is it doing now? Sorry, just give me 2 seconds. Can't remember my own password. So, when one looks here, and again, I'm going to spend 2 seconds on this, but I mean, you can now literally look at managing your global portfolio. And, when you look at your fund investments, you can go into whatever it is, whether it's the medical buildings in America, whether it's, opportunities in Australia, opportunities in London. And you can literally click on, you can get access to all the different information. You can manage all your different wallets now, your bank accounts. So you don't need to have bank accounts all around the world, all in one place. And then even when it comes down to securities, we've actually built it into a back-end regulated listed exchange, so basically a stock exchange. And people can go in and they can literally see what they've invested, where their fees are. And I'm not going to bore you tonight, but with blockchain, in terms of where things are going. So it is really exciting what is possible now. And, I joke with people, but we launched a campaign about a week ago, actually on Freedom Day, the 27th of April in South Africa. And we're really allowing people to go on, and anyone that actually registers on the platform can actually win an apartment in the tallest building in Cape Town. And people say to me, what's the catch? I've got a good friend on tonight, actually, Quinn, that asked me, what's the catch? And, for me, it's a very simple analogy. It's the same as Uber giving away free rides, because once you've tested that there's a technology out there that can offer you such a better service, one tends to, want to be able to use it. And that's really all we're doing. We're enticing people to want to be able to participate. I think, I'm not going to bore you because I really want to get into the questions, but we've now got investors from 18 different countries. We've had $55 million go through the platform. And one of the things that I'm proudest of is that we've got a team of over 50 people. But what I'm proud of is that we've got a 70% reinvestment rate. And that team is really enabling that to happen, where people are seeing that it's working and that they're reinvesting in terms of where they were. We won we were number 41 in the global Fintech, the KPMG Fintech Awards at the end of last year, the only one in Africa. So you talk about celebrating excellence, Clem, and I think, again, as South Africans, we don't do it enough in terms of what is happening. And there's quite a significant board now that's been put in place, both with local and global expertise to help people make sure that they are making the right decisions and where they're going. And, you know, just in conclusion, and then I'll get into the questions, is that, you know, we've got another webinar with Roger Hamilton around some of the global trends in technology. We've got consistent webinars with our partners in the USA, the UK, Australia, and even South Africa, if you want to go to the events at Migrate. And I did tell Clem about this as well, but I'm really excited around sharing with people. So, you know, tonight was all about the scenarios, but really taking 3 hours of your life and getting into the detail of what that means for you. Where should you invest? What should you do? So we've got different sessions. The 25th is in Midrand, and in the morning it's all about property. How do you invest around the world, and ultimately getting into the detail, taking these scenarios and ultimately being able to implement them properly. In the afternoon, it's all around technology. How and what is happening from an exponential technology perspective. We've got Willem van der Post, that is an ex-partner of Deloitte's, where he actually headed up their entire exponential technology division. And anyone that's in real estate has to be there to truly be able to understand what is happening. And then we've got our private wealth partner dinners, which is for our wealth partner community. And we're repeating that session. So there's 2 separate sessions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, for people that are specific. And then obviously in KZN in Durban, we've got the same thing on the 30th of May, and then in Cape Town on the 1st of June. And then a wealth weekend, which is for all our wealth partners that are getting together at the end of June. But I think really what for me is critical is that when you take what Clem's talking about and you overlay that with technology, these are the things that people really need to understand if they want to start having an impact and making the right decisions for them and themselves. And that's, you know, what I wanted to do tonight was to help to understand the framework, and then ultimately in those workshops, you know, be able to give people the guidance as to how and what they could do. So I'm going to put up this slide here. And really the thing that excites me most is that people have the ability to now participate from as little as $1,000. And even in South Africa, we've now launched it where you can literally get involved from as little as 1,000 Rand. And if you do go online and register, literally wealthmigrate.com, you'll get a copy of my book, Property Going Global, which Clem referred to earlier. You've got a whole lot of videos from Dr. Dolph de Roos. You've got all our different white papers. And really, for me, it's about adding value. I wanted to ask some questions here, Clem, because there's quite a few of them. And one of them said, "Hi, Clem. I was fortunate to overhear a speech you gave to the new graduates, I believe UCT students, some time ago. My question is, with the new South African Rand predicament, is maintaining your finances in South Africa still a good investment?"
Yeah, my view, I mean, I can only go by myself, is that I've still got, you know, a very large amount of money sitting in South Africa because, you know, I live here. And, you know, I always remember back, I think it was in the early 2000s, when a lot of people were saying you've got to sell your rands and go overseas. And in fact, the rand sort of doubled in value in terms of overseas currencies, and a lot of people were very sad that they'd put all their eggs in one basket. So, you know, one really should try and have enough rands in this country to basically live your life and obviously put money aside for a pension if you're going to go on living here. Having said all that, it is all about the D word, diversification, and you've got to look at which countries you're going to invest in for all the reasons that you've said. And I really like the way you had done that sort of graph where you showed which countries were high risk, which were low risk and low growth. I mean, that's the way you've got to look at it, and then diversify not just to one other country, but around the world. And you know, I guess Warren Buffett has said the same thing about diversification. I mean, that's how he runs his company. You've got to then decide based on your probabilities for Premier League versus Second Division versus failed state, And you again showed the kind of ratios that would apply in each of those three scenarios. But based on your own probabilities of those three scenarios, you've got to decide exactly what proportion of your overall wealth should be invested locally and overseas.
I must admit, Clem, you said something years ago. I was at an event where you were speaking, and someone asked a very kind of simple question, and you answered it even more simply. And I always believe that people that have simple answers have a great understanding of what they're talking about versus people that try and overcomplicate things. And you literally said something along the lines of, well, how confident are you in the future of South Africa? If it's 70% versus 30%, then you should have 70% in South Africa and 30% overseas. If it's 50-50, it should be 50-50. And I've never forgotten that because it's such a simple methodology. It's not necessarily right or wrong. It just gives people a lot more clarity for them to be able to make simple decisions, you know?
Yep. Life is, in many cases, about having simple formulae and sticking to them. My father, who was a stockbroker in London, had a very simple formula. He said you should have a third of your wealth in shares, a third in property, and a third in cash and bonds. And he says after 2 or 3 years, well, he said you should look at what the percentages are, and then you should revise them back to a third, a third, a third, so that if you've done well in property, you should distribute it back into equities and cash, and if you've done well in equities, and it was a very simple logic. But he said the reason is that I don't trust the future at all, so I keep it at a third, a third, a third, and then I use hindsight to readjust my ratios.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that because I'm reading a fascinating book at the moment, which I highly recommend for everyone, called Unshakable by Tony Robbins. And he said if you readjust, like you've just said, every couple of years, it also forces you to sell high and buy low. Because if real estate, as an example, is done hell of a well, and you have to get it back to a third, a third, a third, it means you're going to sell off some of your real estate at a high level, and you're probably going to be buying, you know, the stock market at a fairly low level. It was a fascinating. I remember you talking about the Mercedes type principle, but not actually. When I read that from Tony Robbins, it was interesting how the two actually overlay together, which is absolutely fascinating for me, you know.
And I have to say, it's basically invoking the Warren Buffett principle: is you buy when other people are fearful, and you sell when other people are, you know, very, very happy, and so forth and so on. You know, that's essentially, you know, being counterintuitive. And as I said about the flags, the real point of the flags is to try and spot those unexpected consequences of the flag, so that you're first in or first out.
Yeah. So this is I'm just showing people that book. You can actually get this in bookstores in South Africa, but I highly recommend this. And you know what's fascinating here is that he's done a huge amount of research. He works with some of the wealthiest people in the world. And if you can save yourself 1% in fees, you can increase your retirement income by over 10 years. And the other thing I found fascinating in the stats is that 96% of funds and mutual funds, etc., don't actually beat the markets. Yet they charge you lots of fees for their brilliance. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the UK right now, there are lots of elderly people who are in real financial problems because, you know, they haven't owned the premium property in London. They've been in the north or in the west or wherever it is. The UK stock market has gone nowhere compared to America. I mean, it was around about 6,900. It peaked at, I think, in 1999. It's 7,300 now, so it's hardly gone up at all. America's doubled. I mean, it's gone from 11,000 to 22,000 in the same period. And so in the UK, with interest rates at virtually zero too, it's been very tough on elderly people who obviously living longer, but are finding it tougher.
Yeah. There's a great question here from Eric. He said, how relevant is the Chinese game? Clem wrote 15 years plus minus. We recently seen information that China is planning on spending hundreds of billions of dollars specifically in Africa over the next 5 to 10 years, with at least 5 billion earmarked for South Africa. Is the current rent extracting regime looking more and more east as they look into Africa and turning on the West colonists?
Yeah, that it was made very clear to me in the session I did in April 2006 that Africa was their continent, as they called it, continent of choice, because they feel that South America is very much the preserve of America, and they really didn't want to start making America angry at the amount of Chinese investment close to America. They said Africa has been ignored by the West. And they said they were filling a vacuum. So Africa has been their favorite continent, but of course they've learned lessons from different African countries in which they've invested. They've tended to go for infrastructure and then obviously do a deal on the natural resources of the country in exchange for building the infrastructure, because they're resource poor in China itself. So they've had other reasons than financial return for doing deals in Africa. But where is China going now? It's interesting. It's becoming quite a high-cost economy. You go to Hong Kong. My son lives in Hong Kong, and if you went 15 to 20 years ago, you had lots of fantastic things you could buy, like cheap cameras, cheap anything. Now Hong Kong's an expensive place to be. So China's having to review its whole strategy of essentially taking Western technology and just producing stuff cheaper than the West, because it's now a fairly prosperous country, and China's going to have to put much more emphasis on innovation and producing stuff like the Americans did because of the entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs. And I'm not sure what their investment strategy is going to be in future, but they are the world's second largest economy. And just remember, in 1978, they were 98. 98. They're 98 in the world. So they've gone from 98 to number 2. And it is the biggest sort of economic miracle of modern times.
That's incredible. I mean, just for anyone who's online, including yourself, Clem, I don't know if we've got an office in China, so I go there regularly, and I got back 2 weeks ago. And I have to say, I get invited to America to go and talk at these innovation conferences, and the Americans think they've really got it, but they really need to go to China. Like, when they understand the impact of WeChat and what the guys are doing and their mobile payments. And I mean, I was there recently. There was this new bike company called MobiBike. It's only been going a year. It already does 20 million rides a day, and they make $1.5 million a day in income. It's raised $450 million in funding. And the scary thing is it's already got 2 competitors in less than 12 months. I mean, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, no, I mean, China's definitely moving into high tech. I can't remember what the headline was in the UK today, but there's another high tech Chinese company that's moving into the UK with completely new products that aren't available in the UK at the moment. So that's where the Chinese are going. And you just got to remember, they were the #1 economy in the world in 1700. So it's the first nation on earth to capture the #1 position twice, because Greece didn't, Egypt didn't, Italy didn't, and Britain certainly hasn't. So, the Chinese probably next year or the year after will become the largest economy in the world again, because of the differential growth rate between China and America. Yeah.
Wow. So just quickly here, there's a great question. Any thoughts on the idea of there being a real threat to the ANC still running this country post 2019?
Yeah, obviously, the biggest flag I told people to watch last year was the municipal elections. And the ANC did not do well in the municipal elections. They lost a lot of votes, partially because people just stayed away and didn't vote for any other party, but equally people actually switching votes. And it's an incredible thing that happened, which is that, not only Cape Town, but Port Elizabeth, Pretoria, and Johannesburg moved into DA hands. So that was a kind of first chapter of what can actually happen in politics in South Africa. And 2019 might well be the second chapter if the ANC aren't very careful about who they choose as their leader of the ANC in December, because they've got to revive the kind of exciting quality that they used to have of being the party of Nelson Mandela, of hope and all the good things. Now people just read about the fights within the ANC, and you know, the same phrase is used over and over again: radical economic transformation, without being spelt out. And as I said, we're in a very divisive phase of the country's history at the moment. So, you know, I think that in December this year, they've got a big decision to make in terms of who the next leader of the ANC is going to be.
And in terms of that, I mean, you know, what impact, you know, you spoke earlier about junk status, so I'm not going to bring that up because you did mention that, but you know, Ron asked a question here: is it conceivable that South Africa will have radical violence from public population over the next couple of years? You know, it's almost what you spoke about with the violence, but that kind of mob violence. I mean, you used to speak about even the Arab Spring and, you know, the not necessarily uneducated, but, you know, unemployed 10 million people that are coming through the ranks, and that I noticed tonight you didn't talk around that Arab Spring kind of logic.
Yeah, and but it is absolutely mentioned, and in fact, Frans Cronje, who's the CEO of the South African Institute of Race Relations, is producing a new South African scenario book, which is going to be out in the next month. And in it, he really opens with the whole Arab Spring in Tunisia. And what you realize that it was because of the unemployment, the youth unemployment in Tunisia, which really started that Arab Spring. It started with one individual who tragically burnt himself to death in the street. But then that actually triggered the whole kind of Arab Spring, and it then spread to the rest of the Arab world for precisely the same reasons that we've got to worry about here, which is very high youth unemployment and people not having any hope of where to go, what to do with their lives, and they get very angry, and then they express that anger in violence.
Yeah. Just there's a question here from someone: where do you see the exchange rate going in the next 12 months? I think, you know, for me, we had a guy called James Painter that actually contributed the chapter 2 in my book, and I would highly recommend everyone goes. He spoke just 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you want to give any comments, Clem, on currency, but he's got very sophisticated methodologies in kind of tracking the currency and linking it to sentiment plus the other fundamentals. And I'm just letting people know, if they are interested, that I would highly recommend checking that out as well. I don't know if you want to answer that or you want me to move on.
I'm happy to answer it because, you know, the currency on the whole has done much better since the downgrade than a lot of people thought. And I've forgotten the guy who wrote the article, but he basically showed the study of the Big Mac index over the last 20 years. And he's the economist who's the most accurate about predicting what the exchange rate is going to be in December. And he basically said that right now the Rand is at a really much bigger discount on the dollar in terms of purchasing power parity, which is what the whole point of the Big Mac index is, than it has been historically. And that's one reason why he is basically projecting 13 Rand to the dollar at the end of this year. But it was just quite an interesting take on it, that you've got to really study the purchasing power parity of the Rand. And it's why the tourist industry is doing so well in South Africa, because it's an incredibly cheap place to visit. I mean, I remember in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, a cappuccino in one restaurant cost me 100 Rand. Well, I don't think there's any restaurant in South Africa where you pay 100 Rand for a cappuccino. You know, we are a very cheap country, and for that reason, the Rand may not tank in the way that some people have suggested it would if we were given junk status.
Just a quick one here. It's a great question that, you know, quite frankly, I asked myself. I've got a 5-year-old boy, but Bradley asked, what career advice direction would you give a 16-year-old boy? What should he study if his future career does not currently exist? What career advice direction would you give? Oh, it's the same thing. Sorry, so it's the same thing twice. But yeah, basically a 16-year-old, you know, boy or girl. What career advice direction do you give people? I'm sure you get asked this all the time.
Yeah, and my answer is very simple: is that that question would have been very correct in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because that's the way people worked their lives. They sat back and said, what is it that fits with my talent, my passion, and then looked at the companies that might actually make it happen for them. But as I said earlier on, the biggest change caused by technology is that young people have to become much more innovative. They have to actually look at maybe approaching some of their friends to work in small teams, and then they've got to decide what they're very good at and what they're passionate about, and say, what marketable products can we produce given this passion? And then they've got to draw up a business plan, which means that they try and minimize the amount of money that has to go in up front, and obviously creates revenue which is more than expenses, and then they've got to go to their respective parents and get the capital. And they've got to start the business. So it is a totally different approach.
or sorry to butt in, or to use crowdfunding. Roger Hamilton is online tomorrow night. Unfortunately, the both of you are only available this week. But his son actually started his business at the age of 14 and raised $45,000 through crowdfunding, and is off to the races. So really, there's great technologies out there now.
Back to your $1,000 point. Crowdfunding is one of the most powerful tools, and that's why I would love to see a electronic stock exchange being developed in places like Cape Town and Johannesburg, where people can, it's like eBay, you can put your whole concept of your business online, and you can say, come and visit my business. So in that sense, you would probably not get Johannesburg investors investing in Cape Town. You would say to people, come and see my business, see what I'm trying to do. And so it's like an electronic version of Dragon's Den. And then this is what I'm prepared to sell shares in my business for, and so forth and so on. So you have a kind of eBay, which is in fact an electronic stock exchange.
It's fascinating, Clem. Just to give you, I'm conscious of the time here, but just to give you an update on that, so England is the best country in the world at the moment that's embracing kind of fintech crowdfunding. And there's a company there called Crowdcube. They've done over 50 launches now where they've raised more than £1 million. One of the more recent ones, they launched £1 million in 98 seconds. It went on to raise £10 million. And it's had a massive, and it's really been supported by the government. And it's had a massive impact on starting businesses and that very job creation you were talking about earlier.
And my point is that big businesses in this tough economic environment, because this is the slow growth century compared to the last 40 years of the last century. We're in a slow growth environment. As I said, we're in an aging world which tends to as I said, clockwork flag ticking away, which keeps growth rates low. So it's going to be medium-sized and small business where the real action is if you really want to make money. And yeah. Having said that, we get back to dividends, and dividends being an important component, but it doesn't alter the fact that the real capital gains are going to be made in small and medium-sized business with new ideas.
Well, the good news is, just by the way, is that Caroline de Silva's come out, and we've actually been invited by the FSB to meet with them on Monday. So we really are making progress now in South Africa around some of these new technologies, which is really exciting. So watch this space. Niley said that there's a great book that people should look at called from Harry Dent on demographics. It's called Demographic Cliff. So I think that's probably a lot of what you're talking about with the grey flag. Someone's asked here, I think you've asked it about the populist, the kind of the radical socialist undertones, and the concern that if they're losing votes, that they do a knee-jerk reaction, similar to, I presume, like a Zimbabwe, where it was running actually pretty well for 20-odd years, and then they knee-jerked with the whole land thing to try and get back results. How does one plan for that from a scenario perspective, a flags perspective?
Yeah, my point about the independence of judiciary and other institutions flag comes into play there, because it's very difficult to get the singularity of power as president of this country that you can get in some of the other African countries. And indeed, you know, I think it's quite a good thing that the military in this country also operate as an independent unit. So, you know, yes, the knee-jerk reaction tends to be, let's do things which are really populist and like nationalization and expropriation and all those kind of things. But I certainly believe, because of that flag of us being a much more decentralized society, that it has less chance of happening here. And that's why, as I said, you know, we've revised the failed state scenario down to 10 to 15%, while others might have actually increased that particular scenario. But yeah, we you know, if you look at just ordinary South Africa, living every day in South Africa, there's an immense amount of goodwill and an immense amount of talent right across the country. So yeah, I don't think that we need that polarization. And indeed, I have to say that, you know, yes, the government has changed the cabinet, and or president has changed the cabinet, and all that has happened, but we haven't actually had, you know, the sort of really nasty rhetoric being intensified since that reshuffle happened. But obviously, you've got to watch. There's an important, I think, mid-year meeting of the ANC, and then one's got to watch the way the new leader is selected later in the year to get the real feel for that kind of scenario, which, as I said, affects one's whole investment strategy, and obviously, in the end, affects the strategy of where you want to live with your family.
Clem, a quick, I want to respect your time, and there's hundreds of people online here asking questions as fast as we're answering them. Are you okay for a few more, and then we'll wrap it up?
Yeah. Which means I'm a good forecaster, because I said 2 hours and you said 90 minutes.
Fantastic. So there's a great question here. It's on a different level, but it's asking, I would like to know what your thoughts are around Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and how you see them impacting the world of finance and banking in comparison with fiat currencies in general. Does he see cryptocurrencies and gold as smart investments for the average person in order to hedge their fast depreciating paper money?
Yeah, and I'm going to be very cautious on this one, because I've looked at Bitcoins, I've read about Bitcoins. I simply, you know, don't really understand the kind of, you know, the platform on which they operate sufficiently to say that they are a secure currency. And I know that a lot of people who are very high tech say there is the security in the Bitcoin market. I'm simply not able to comment on that, as my son sometimes calls me stoneage.com. So I'm not about to say that about Bitcoins. But the real point is this, is that if there isn't an international currency like a Bitcoin, you've got to be diversified in sovereign currencies, which means, you know, having dollars, having pounds, rands, maybe a few European euros, and so forth and so on, because the way you protect your wealth is to have your investments in different currencies. And maybe one day we will have a world currency which reflects certain proportions in different currencies, but we don't have that at the moment. And what's interesting is that gold hasn't lived up to its reputation, because, you know, in the kind of uncertain times we live in, and with no opportunity cost virtually of holding gold because of zero interest rates, I'm amazed that the gold price hasn't done better than it has. And so it's very difficult to offer a view on currency other than to say you should be diversified.
Just a quick one. I get asked that question quite a lot, and I actually come back to what you said about income. I'm always careful of anything, whether it's gold or Bitcoins, if it's purely on capital growth and not on income. So,
Yeah.
people just need to be aware of that. James asked a question, where do we see the global property market going, etc. I think from my perspective there, I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail in the next couple of weeks of those events. And I think you have mentioned it to an extent. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add around it.
Not really. As I said, and I said it, to you when you were writing the book and previously, given the grey flag of the aging of the European population, America is definitely a more attractive market, and it was for me an interesting chart that you put up where you showed that the real value of property is still below where it was in 2006 in America, whereas, as I said, the stock market has actually doubled. And so, yeah, I do think that, with obviously due process of examining where to invest in the United States, it has to be an attractive market. And I obviously have to say, because of Brexit, and nobody knowing what the actual deal is going to be. I mean, nobody has a clue, because Britain says it does not going to pay anything for future liabilities, whereas Europe is opened with 100 billion euros. So it's at the moment poles apart, and so even though Theresa May has a very good chance of increasing her majority in the House of Commons, she's got a heck of a task to negotiate a decent deal for the UK, and particularly for London, which obviously voted to remain for the obvious reason that a lot of the service industries in London have been not only servicing British but European citizens. And so, as I said earlier on, this headline today that 9,000 jobs are going to be moved to Europe from London in the financial industries field. That's the kind of stuff that obviously will reflect on the property market.
So quick question here. Someone's asked whether the current government has asked for your advice, and if you've got any insights as to whether it'll be, Nkosazana Zuma or Ramaphosa or anyone else.
Okay, well, the answer is I think the race is more open now. I think Cyril had 6 months ago, a lot of people were giving him a very low probability, but he's certainly received a lot of popular response in some of the meetings that he's held around the country, and therefore my intuitive feel, without knowing anything about the internal workings of the ANC, is that he's actually become a much stronger candidate, and there may be somebody else out there. I mean, as I said, the anti-establishment flag has produced Donald Trump from nowhere, Macron from nowhere. It produced Brexit from nowhere. So you just don't know whether there might be somebody else who's going to put their hat into the ring over the next year. And maybe it's as a person rather than being a member of the ANC who suddenly captures popular imagination. So it's going to be, I think, a very, very interesting race into 2019.
A great question here, and I'm going to try and wrap it up, but have you done any scenario planning on other countries in Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique specifically?
Yeah, well, getting back to that first bit of the last question, the places that I've actually done sessions with people in government or had dealings with people in government. In Africa, it's Namibia, it's Botswana. But interestingly, Chantal and I, about 6 or 7 years, did a joint facilitation for ZANU-PF. We actually did it in Johannesburg. They flew the people who, the finance minister and a few other members of cabinet and some of their advisors down, and we had a 2-day session on the future of Zimbabwe. I don't know how much they've used that for the internal strategy of ZANU-PF, but there's some very bright minds in the party, and I just hope they come to the fore now, because Zimbabwe's in a very tough situation. I know Chantel has done quite a lot of work in Nigeria, and I think also in Kenya. And then overseas, as I said, what was really interesting was spending time at the Central Party School in Beijing, and showing how scenario planning works. And I had the real strategists behind the Politburo in China at this particular session. In Australia, I was asked by the Local Government Managers Association to do all the major cities. So I've done strat sessions with Perth, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, and then some of the small places in Australia, such as Alice Springs. So, that was interesting. And one of the most interesting takeaways from that is one of the flags, which I didn't talk about in the presentation I gave, but which is very apropos of the future of Cape Town, is water, because our dam levels have declined over the last 10 years in terms of percentage left in the dam at this point of the year. I mean, there's 20% at the moment in the Cape dams, and only 10% of that is usable. So we're down to 10%, whereas last year it was at least 20, if not more percent. But 15 years ago, it was sitting at 30 or 40% at its minimum. So yes, June is the month that it really rains and the dams pick up. But Perth was in exactly the same situation as this 15 years ago, when the population had risen to 2 million from 1 million in the 90s, just as Cape Town's population has gone from 3 to 4 million. And the decision that was taken at this session, when we played the parched Perth scenario, was to build a desalination plant. And now 30% of Perth's water is provided by desalination. And we should be doing exactly the same in Cape Town, because you cannot have a city running out of water, because there's no way you can bring 10,000 trucks of water in to Cape Town on a daily basis to basically keep the population alive. So it is a real crunch issue.
Wow. So there's a great question here. If we get downgraded by Moody's, do you see the reintroduction of exchange control?
It could happen, yeah. It could happen, and the only answer I can give is that a lot of people were forecasting much steeper declines as a result of the downgrades we've had so far, and I'll be interested to see if Moody's downgrade us, whether it's the same, that actually the currency doesn't fall that much. Because, as I said, for me, the reality of the situation is I'm actually probably a little more optimistic now than I was 6 months ago, because of the pushback, as I said, on corruption, and also the fact that, you can see there's a lot of debate in the ruling party about where to go to from here. And that's why I'm going to watch the flags very closely on the sort of economic conversations they're going to have in the next month or two.
There's a great question here from Alan. He said, do you think the judiciary system can survive the state capture?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I think it can. And indeed, it has very well. And a lot of the appointments that are in the judiciary were made by the ANC and by the president. And there's big pushback, really big pushback by the judiciary. And as I said, there's just not the singularity of power in this country that you had in other, authoritarian and dictatorial regimes. And it's one of the great strengths of this country is we have this diversity here, which I think will protect the independence of the judiciary.
Excellent. So Brandon asked, which is better, start investing in residential, commercial? Brandon, for me, come to the property events. We can go into that in detail. Louise asked, what do you do with a 16-year-old? For me, that whole thing with Willem van der Post around not only you've spoken about entrepreneurial education, but also just understanding technologies. I really welcome people to bring their families, bring their children. It reminds me of a great story of my business partner, Henny Besaidnout, who many years ago, Clem, was in I was in a room. It was yourself, it was Robin Banks, and it was Dr. Doftarus who were presenting that day. And there were 200 people in the room, and there were 3 children. And I remember thinking about it that day. It was like a Thursday, and the 3 children were all Henny's children. I remember going up to him, and I said to him, "Why were your children at this event and not at school, like everyone else in this room?" And he said, "Scott, what could they learn at school today that would have been more valuable than learning from you, Dr. Doftarus, and Robin Banks?" And I tell you what, I was blown away, just a whole different way of understanding when it came to educating children. His daughter, by the way, has gone on to now specialize in exponential technologies. She's done a short master's course at Stanford, and is one of the most employable people in South Africa, as in she had more than 10 job offers the moment she left university at the end of last year, and literally can, in my opinion, be a global citizen and travel the world. And it all started by coming and seeing you when she was in Standard 7 or Standard 8. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the points I make is that I would love, if I was younger, to take a class at school, a class photograph, and then look at what happened after that class left school and who became a success, who was a failure. Because I actually feel that there's very little correlation between success at school and success afterwards, because you get the most amazing people who don't do well at school but become incredible entrepreneurs afterwards. And if you look at Bill Gates, if you look at Mark Zuckerberg, if you look at Stephen Jobs, they weren't great students, but they just had that flair which led to them doing well. And of course, recently Forbes voted the #1 entrepreneur in the United States is Elon Musk. And Elon was educated at Pretoria Boys High. And you know, in his book, he thought he was bullied and everything else. And so, yeah, I'd just like to get it across to young people that, you know, that being a success in afterlife is not dependent on how well you do at school. It's how well do you relate to people? How well do you convert your idea into a product and then sell that product? Obviously, I want those kind of skills to be taught at school.
Yeah. Look, I think that's a good note to end off on. And, you know, to use your analogy, which you even put on the very front of the book here, I hope the book will convert readers into foxy property investors. You know, for me, I think it's an awesome way to end off where, you know, whether it's to children or whether it's to adults, it's about being foxy now. It's about educating yourself. It's about getting access to the right information and ultimately, you know, being that entrepreneurial. And when you look at Elon Musk, one of the things, and it's a fantastic book, I would highly recommend everyone reads it. But really, there's one thing that I believe we're truly, truly privileged of as South Africans, and that's that we've got tenacity. We've got the ability to deal with chaos. You know, there's a great saying that I heard once about chaos management. And, you know, so as a South African, I think you must really value, you know, your upbringing and some of that chaos and some of that tenacity, because it really puts you in good stead to not only succeed in South Africa, but also on the global stage. You know, it kind of gives me, you know, to finish off, you know, you've got to ask yourself, whether it's in business or investing, what business are you in today? Where are you going to be in 3 years? Where are you going to be in 10 years? What innovation is it playing in your life? You know, I think even in the years Clem's noticed from my side, where we evolved from IPS, where we, you know, help people invest in direct property, to now an entire online technology platform to really enable people to be able to participate with far lower barriers to entry and greatly increasing that trust and transparency. And, you know, our vision and our dream, I got asked today, actually, funny enough, by the doctor, and the lady said, what is my purpose? Why am I here? And, you know, my father, unfortunately or fortunately, but went to school. He did everything you're talking about, Clem. He went to school, he went to university, he studied to be a chartered accountant, he was financial director of Rainbow Chickens, and therefore he did everything he was taught to do, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, and yet when he died, he unfortunately tried to draw 50 Rand from Standard Bank and had been declined 24 hours earlier. And I learned at a very young age that, you know, I became passionate about understanding and studying what wealthy people are doing. And, you know, for us, our vision and our purpose is to really help people empower themselves and ultimately to put smart investing in everyone's pocket. And when you consider tonight what tonight has all been about, it's been really learning your methodologies. How does scenario planning work? What are the flags so that people can watch those flags and ultimately they can make smart decisions for them and their family? And it's something that I feel very, very passionately about. And I think growing up in Africa, we've also are all born where we come from a place where we understand wealth, but we also see poverty on a daily basis. And I think it's not only our duty, but it's our responsibility to go out there and to teach people, and you know, and for people to realize that there's another way now, and that they can take responsibility for themselves, they can take responsibility for their lives, for the work that they do, and even for their wealth. And you know, I learned that lesson, and I'm not going to explain it tonight, but I spoke about it in chapter 1 of my book, about the difference between my father, who followed the traditional route that he was taught, and my uncle that did something very different, which was all about taking control of his life, investing. Even though he lived in Zimbabwe, he started investing overseas at the age of 30, and it really allowed him to have the freedom, which is what I talk about as a global citizen, to have the freedom to do whatever he wanted in his life. And that's all that I really want to, you know, share with people tonight, and why I want to thank you so much, Clem, for your time. The insights that you've shared tonight have been absolutely invaluable, and it's so valuable to have someone like you from South Africa sharing for South Africans. It's respected at a global level, but yet South Africans get to be able to participate and take credence from it. And if anyone's feeling complicated, you know, confused or overwhelmed, don't worry. I've heard Clem speak many, many times, and even again tonight, I was vociferously taking notes all the way through the process, which I will share with people. But my point being is that don't worry if it's overwhelming and difficult the first time. It does take a little bit of time, but quite soon you'll get it, and it will become a really, really valuable tool and methodology for you to be able to make the right decisions for you and your family. So thank you to everyone online. Thank you to the team who's organized tonight, and particularly Denise. I know, Clem, you're in Denise's house, so thank you to her and her family for helping you with your Wi-Fi going down. But most importantly, Clem, thank you for you sharing so much tonight. I really, really appreciate it.
And I'll end with a benediction. May the fox be with you.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening, and see you soon. Hopefully we'll see you all at the May events. There's certainly not going to be events that you want to miss. Cheers.
Cheers. Phew.